Hey everyone, welcome to this. This is Module 4. Um, who do we think we are? And the question here really is the question of identity, and our case study is feminism. And we'll be looking at some feminist issues. But first of all, what I want to say is this isn't really a class about feminism or a module about feminism, but we're using feminism as a way to think about how identity plays out. We could pick race. We could pick issues for example to do with people who are suffering from physical disabilities. There's a number of ways we could pick age. Certainly there are a lot of ways in which identity can play out politically for us. So this is just really one kind of angle on it. But it's the angle, nevertheless, that we'll use because it helps us build up, if you will, our little toolbox of what is going on in the world in terms of identity and how identity matters. So, in keeping with the themes that we've looked at so far in the class, the themes of how certain mental scenarios are frameworks of thinking can shape our perceptions and create what we called, using Stephen Colbert, truthification. If you remember from our very first lecture, we've been interested since then in looking at a variety of different types of truthifications, so to speak. We've looked at environment and how frames of the environment can help or hinder the cause of global warming. We've looked at the role of religion. Well, actually, that was because we reversed Module 4 and 5. But so typically, religion would have been our Module 5, and this would be our Module 4. So if we reverse those, I apologize. But back to the lecture. This week we're looking at feminism, and we will again try to figure out how scenario-based thinking matters for us as students and scholars of international politics and global affairs. Coming up pretty soon, we have International Women's Day. Just to let you know, it's celebrated every year on March 8th. The first National Women's Day was observed across the United States on February 28th, 1909, but they changed it to make it international. And this is a movie you can watch if you want. It's just something I encourage you to try to find. I think you can find it online if you want, but it's not for the exam or anything. It's just optional. Let's talk about some basic facts that confront women in the world today. These are just realities that show us that it's important to ask the question, where are the women? How are the women doing, so to speak? In this class coming up, we're going to do a lot of talking about in-groups and out-groups. In-groups are sometimes groups that have tremendous power. Now, obviously, in-groups are sometimes not powerful, or they don't dominate. But most of the time, in-groups dominate. And in-groups can dominate unconsciously. They're not even aware that they're doing it sometimes. So here, the in-group, in relation to the facts on the board, are pretty much the entire global population of men. And women are the outgroup. And men, in many parts of the world, are conscious of their domination. But I think most men are not entirely aware of it. They don't really believe that they're acting towards women in bad faith. And I think that's an important point that we want to keep in mind for later in the lecture, because it matters that also I think women sometimes are responsible for internalizing some of the negative understandings about women that are out there. And maybe women also play a role in their own self-domination as well. But nevertheless, if we look at the facts on the board here, they are very important. They suggest to us that women are not doing well. Of the world's 1 billion poorest people, 60% are women and girls. That's clearly telling us or showing us that women are in trouble. That of the poorest people on the planet, the majority of them are women, and the majority of them are not doing very well. Um, Women work 2/3 of the world's working hours, yet earn only 10% of the income. I think that's really interesting. Um, how would how does it strike us? I mean, men tend not to really be able to appreciate that because it's not a fact that's obvious. It's not spoken about very often, if at all, really. But women work 2/3 of the world's available working hours. What are the men doing? Do the men just get to go home earlier or something? It's hard to understand why that would be so. Yet we're told statistically that it's true and quite reliable. But women are only earning 10% of the income that's being earned on the planet. That tells us really something, that men are definitely, going to be more of the millionaires. That's one issue. Men are rising to the top of global corporate and political ladders, as we say in later on. Men occupy most of the positions of power in the world, whether it's corporate power, economic power, political power, religious power. Another fact that I think becomes very relevant is to do with land ownership, and this also plays into this question of power, right? Women only own 1% of the land, so they're only earning a very small amount of the world's income, and they're owning literally a tiny percentage of the world's land. So that tells us on a global basis the kind of material power that women would have if they were ever to try to fight the power of the in-group of men. And again, hang on there, because I'm going to define this term in-group in just a little while. But I'm just trying to set out the material situation that women are confronting right now. On the second column, deaths in war today are 90% civilian. I think that's really phenomenal. 90% civilian deaths is a really staggering figure about war to think about. Because we tend to think about wars as confrontations between armies, and we tend to think that the people who die in wars are soldiers, but in fact they're not. In the world today, very few of those people who die are soldiers, and mostly the people who die in war are women and children. So that tells us something again about the effect or the impact our politics is having on women disproportionately to men. We also learned that women make up 2/3 of the estimated 776 million adults worldwide who cannot read or write. And I think that's a very interesting fact. Because, of course, if you're going to change the world, literacy is a big deal. It's going to be determinant for example, for women's ability to coordinate with each other and learn about the world around them, so that they can find out that they're not the only ones suffering this way, that there are others out there like them, and reach out and communicate with those other people over distance. Girls make up 55% of the 75 million children not attending school. Again, it's just to do with power, isn't it? Women would be more empowered if they had educations, that's for sure. Okay, so we'll just move on now to some of our theoretical development. And we're talking about the question of identity. So Anique Wibben in her chapter tells us that we are storytellers. We are, as she says, homo fabulans. And homo fabulans are interesting people. They are us. They are a people who are not so much determined by what they are biologically, although of course they are determined by what they are biologically. But interestingly, for human beings, Karl Marx once said it a long time ago, and he's not the only one. Darwin said it too. That the interesting thing about humans is, like, we're the only animals that can really change our species being. And a lot of that change, it seems to me, comes through the fact that we tell stories to each other about who we are. And if we change our story, we literally change who we are. We talked about that in week 1 to a certain extent. The idea of a kind of a reciprocal loop, or a self-predicting prophecy based on the stories that we're telling each other about who we are. So what sort of stories can we tell each other? Well, this week we're kind of focused on the question of identity. And on the right-hand side here of this slide, we have a lot of markers of identity. nationality, ethnicity, race, gender, class, sexuality, religion. All of these things can be lines along which we can tell stories. They are the sort of threads that we can pull on if we want to understand the fabric of how human society is composed. Nationality, ethnicity, race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, all of these things matter, right? For our analysis. We're focusing in on just one, of course. We're focusing in on gender. But a lot of what we're talking about could be applied to the other stories as well. So for Wibben, she gives us a definition. She says, identity politics is a key form of political activism inspired by the interests of and intended to benefit a particular group with a shared identity. That is, a key form of political activism shared by the interests of and intended to benefit a particular group with a shared identity. A particular group with a shared identity. So that could be, people from Chillicothe. It could be people from Columbus. It could be men in Columbus. It could be people from Ohio. It could be Americans, or white Americans, or you name it, right? Male Americans. So the point is that it's people who are conscious of their membership of a particular group and conscious of the fact that they have this shared identity with this particular group, something in common with them. As Wibben tells us, we are being shaped as members of this group, often even before we're born. If you think about it, especially for boys and girls, before they're born, the parents are making decisions about what color to paint the nursery, what to put up on the walls, depending on whether they've heard that it's a boy or a girl, or they haven't decided to find out yet, so they can leave things in a sort of a neutral, decorative arrangement in the room. But certainly we've all heard of stories about people getting rooms ready for a baby to arrive. So if we're homo fabulantes, then we are really nothing more, sociologically speaking at least, than the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. Stories that establish us as members of one group and not of another. And we know that we're learning about this from a young age. But what kind of groups do we end up in? Some groups are very harsh and strict on the rules that they have set up, and other groups are not so strict or harsh. They're quite open-minded. For example, some religions require members to practice only one faith. Others don't. Others may be very open to interpolating the religious doctrines that they would teach with other religious doctrines. One important thing to know about here is this idea of the constitutive outside. And what does that mean? Well, it means really that we can't really know what it means to be us until we know who or what is outside that group, right? We don't really know what it means to be a white male American until we look at what non-white, non-male Americans are. That is to say that we're defined negatively, not in a negative fashion or pejoratively. I don't mean in that sense. I mean we're defined by what we're not. We tend to look at others around us and categorize them as, oh, they're the sort of people to do that sort of thing. We're not that sort of people, even though that may not necessarily be true. And the generalizations about those people over there may not be consistently true, much the same as our thought about our own virtue may not be always consistently true. So the outside group is an important factor here because it is the thing that allows the inside group to exist, and I want you to keep that in mind. The in-groups, that is to say the people inside the group, are the ones that get to decide what the membership criteria are, i.e. that you're white and male, for example. The in-groups can be weak or strong, but if the in-group is powerful, we can use the word hegemonic. We can say that in-groups are hegemonic. Not all in-groups are powerful that way, or don't exercise their power in that way. In-groups generally do have a certain amount of power. This means that they can enforce their membership limits and the privileges these limits entail upon others, right? They can They can reward or deny access to privileges, access to resources. And they can do that by imprisoning the other, driving the other away, casting them out, in order to maintain some sort of purity of the in-group. So this means that stories have real material effects. It means, for example, that men, for a very long time, were able to maintain their domination over women through this kind of procedure, which is really remarkable. Now, identities are never complete. That's another point that we have to say. Just because men are an in-group, just because white American men may be an in-group, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean that that identity is locked down. And one of the things that we'll see is how identities are constantly, if you will, leaking, that they are, people are coming up with new and interesting ways of playing on that theme. So, for example, typically the white American male, the ideal there is John Wayne, who was a cowboy. And this is what Anique Wibben mentions in the text. But, along comes a movie like Brokeback Mountain. And it's a movie there that changes the white American male stereotype and works with that to make to offer a story about a romantic affair that runs on for a very long time between two men. And of course that is introducing homosexuality into the pure narrative of what it means to be the in-group of the white American male. So clearly within society there is a possibility of change, and we're not fixed by identity. Narratives can be fluid, and narratives are always evolving. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, of course, identity doesn't just matter for women. I just wanted to stop and pause here to look at this map. This is a map of the former Yugoslavia, which shows how clearly the various ethnicities of Yugoslavia were also arranged, and you can see in various in-groups and out-groups. The major in-group in the Yugoslavian conflict was, of course, the Serbian group, but there were other groups too, and even the Bosnians were, to a certain extent, in-groupish during the war that happened there. And we know that because in-groups, as we say, typically have a bit of power, and they use that power to reward or deny privileges to what they regard as the other. So while by and large the Croatians and the Bosnians were the victims of the Serbians in the war, most historians and people who've looked at it would well understand that there were limited instances, especially for the Croats, where they were the in-group and they were the ones dominating and doing the, as it were, ethnic cleansing. So that's a key word for us to think about, ethnic cleansing, as we try to reflect on how and why these areas fell into conflict. Now, on the Blackboard site for you guys this week, there is a clip from a movie. It's under week 4, module 4 movies or files on Blackboard, and in this movie you can clearly see how in the north of Ireland some of these issues have played out just between Catholics and Protestants, and that's to give you a clear impression of how these politics, these identity politics, can play out in a diversity of areas, in a diversity of ways. So I wanted to show you that video because Michael Ignatieff, the guy who made that video, he's also someone who studied Yugoslavia, and he has a lot of insights into how identity politics work to create ethnic conflict in these sorts of parts of the world. But, obviously ethnic conflict can happen anywhere. But in Northern Ireland and in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, ethnic conflict has been quite dramatic in terms of its ability to create political violence. So for our story here, though, if we're just going to focus on Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia shows why identities matter. As Ignatieff argues, and I think Anik Wibben argues in the chapter that you've been assigned for your homework this week, the breakup of Yugoslavia was not automatic. Serbians and Croatians and Bosnians didn't always think about themselves as Serbians, Croatians and Bosnians. During the Yugoslavian years, the 50 years that Yugoslavia existed after World War II, many of these people believed that they were Yugoslavians, and they knew what Croatians were. They knew they had Croatian-Serbian background. They might have had Croatian and Serbian cultures and practices, but they didn't necessarily constitute them as a nation. It didn't necessarily make them want to break away from each other. In fact, there was a lot of intermarrying. People moved freely between the cities. They spoke the same language. They looked the same. They did practice different religions, and they did have some different words for different things. The Croatians tended to write in the Western Roman alphabetical style. The Serbians tended to write in Cyrillic, which is the more Russian-looking alphabet. So there were those differences, but there were not very strong group identities, it must be said. Under Marshal Tito, who was the dictator of Yugoslavia for all that time, the country, or for most of that time anyway, the country did hold together and was remarkable in some ways because of all the Eastern Bloc countries. This was the one communist country that was not aligned with the Soviet Union. It was a non-aligned state, and as such it had a lot of cultural openness and sort of thriving intellectual cultural scene, many people will say. So it's unusual with that kind of openness and transparency in the society relative to other communist countries that Yugoslavia would have this trouble when it fell apart. So what happened? What went wrong? Well, Ignatieff argues that one of the things that was going on in Yugoslavia was that it started as a crisis of political legitimacy. Once the federal administration of Yugoslavia fell apart, it really sort of became an issue then for the regional governors. They wanted to hold on to their political power. They wanted to hold on to the way they had done things under the old communist regime. And so what they started to do was they started to activate in their discourse these old notions of history from way, way back before Yugoslavia existed. They tried to dig out the myths and the histories of Croatia and Serbia, and they tried to create a political fear. Remember, if you're watching this and we have put Module 5 before Module 4, then you'll remember from the module on religion that we watched the movie The Power of Nightmares, which makes a very similar argument about fear. But if you're watching this Module 4 before Module 5, then you'll be coming up to The Power of Nightmares next week when you watch that movie. Okay, so it just depends on whether you're watching Module 4 or 5 in order here. But in terms of The Power of Nightmares, you see a very clear argument that politicians these days know very well how to manipulate fear, how to create a sense that, oh my gosh, those people over there, they're coming to get us if we don't do something about it. And of course, the concern for the regional governors of Yugoslavia after the fall of the Berlin Wall was how to maintain their power. So they used these old myths and these feelings and stories from the past about the ancient conflicts that existed between these people to stir up patriotic pride and fear of the other, and the fact that the other was coming to steal their resources and coming to get them. And these stories became more powerful as feelings intensified. And you can see this in the video that I've uploaded for you for this week about Northern Ireland, actually. Have a look at how those narratives are used there to maintain fear of the other through these very, very sort of grandiose generalizations in many ways. And some, clearly those generalizations are problematic. But tragically here in Yugoslavia, it went quite far. It went even much further than the north of Ireland. The Serbs and Croatians sometimes started to use practices of ethnic cleansing, things that hadn't been seen in Europe since World War II, and which European leadership promised would never happen again. Concentration camps, rape, forced labor, random executions, mass graves. Really, that's the sort of thing that we after World War II, the Europeans said they never wanted to see again. Yet, during the Yugoslav conflict, it was happening right on their doorstep. So moving moving on to U.S. feminism, which is our primary case study for this module. In the slide here, we have the picture of Betty Friedan, who wrote a book called *The Feminine Mystique*. Now, we've said already that hegemonic in-groups, powerful in-groups, can victimize other groups. And one of the great questions that the second wave feminists asked was, how does that work? The first wave feminists, of course, like Dorothy Pankhurst and others, were the wave of feminists that got the vote for women. The second wavers believed that getting the vote was not enough, that women were still in some ways victimized by the expectations of the major in-group that subjugated them, and that was the male in-group in the United States of America. So by asking the question, where are the women, much as we did at the start of the lecture, women were able to produce a convincing data set that showed that women were still not getting the same wages as men. Women were still not getting the same promotion opportunities as men. Women were generally being housewives and not taking up jobs like being a lawyer or being a doctor. So the second wavers believed that nobody had really looked at society to see where the women actually were and how they were doing, what positions women were occupying. And once they started to compile this data set, it became very apparent that basic political liberty, their power to vote, was not really enough, that it didn't really fully level the playing fields. So what Betty Friedan was interested in was patriarchy, right? In other words, the standards of what counts as female virtue, or the real women, is based on the experience of men, being the male gaze. And she comes up with this term, the feminine mystique, to try to explain the power of this male gaze, this male perspective that basically creates the stereotype or the norm that men expect women to live up to, and women must live up to in order to be accepted and to gain access to resources from men. So the feminine mystique is this term that we use to explain patriarchy, right? It's this norm, it's this powerful norm that legitimates patriarchy and keeps patriarchy alive. So what was the specific content of this feminine mystique, our social norm? Well, it was a mystique that primarily said that it was unfeminine for women to gain education and to gain careers, etc., to want to rise above their station. And you can see this very clearly in some of the TV shows that go back and represent life back then. Or if you want to go back and look at shows that existed in the past, black and white I Love Lucy kind of style shows, you can see quite clearly how those norms are very clearly stated, and it was very hard for women to step outside of their expected place. Their expected place, of course, being in the home. So Betty Friedan was asking the question then, why do women not try to transcend the role of the housewife and the mother? Why do they continuously forsake their possibilities to have a more advanced career and have a higher education? Women, from Betty Friedan's perspective, do not strive to seek full determination, full self-determination. They don't strive to achieve full dignity for themselves. And so the mystique is powerful in this sense because it undermines women's rights to have all these things, right? Women don't think that they're entitled to it, and it's basically because they believe what men tell them about themselves, or they believe what male culture tells women about themselves. What would you say would be a solution to this kind of problem? Well, for Betty Friedan's perspective, the solution is to engage in a politics of education, to strategize education, to try to campaign for things that women need, because women are different to men and can't be expected to live in this according to the exact same rules as men. They need special things in order to be able to function equally in society, right? They need, for example, daycare. They need often times reproductive freedom. In order to be a woman, if you want to be sexually active at least, it helps to have access to control over your reproductive rights. And so technologies exist to allow women to do that in terms of contraception. So people often talk about the pill as being one of the great technologies that emerged that allowed women to make much greater strides in a man's world. And so ultimately a lot of it though is about education, raising consciousness, and that takes a long time, right? Because education doesn't happen overnight. One of the things that the second wave feminists have been really good at is talking about privilege. And I wanted to put in a little comment about this today with you here. Privilege is a very real thing. Many people, many men, for example, today, if you ask them about what they think about women's rights, they're not that especially open towards the idea of it. And that's sad, of course, because there's a lot to be gained by thinking about women's rights. And there is a lot at stake as well. I mean, I guess one of the things that men are bad at seeing is that they do have advantage in so many ways, especially white men have advantage in so many ways that they're not conscious of. And that doesn't mean that men are intentionally not conscious of it or deliberately not listening. It just means that this is kind of how bias works. For powerful in-groups, they're not often aware of the fact that they're being seen so negatively. So I want to give you an example. This is from a racial perspective. A friend of mine who is white and a male told me not that long ago that he and his wife had tried to buy a house one day. And later he learned that earlier that same day, a black couple had tried to buy that same house and had been turned down. And they bumped into these people at a coffee shop and they got talking about it. And the discussion, basically, they tried to figure out the reasons why the owner of the house would have turned away a black couple from buying the house. And they came up with this idea that probably it was that the owner of the house felt that if he owned other properties in the area, the black couple moving into the area would bring the value of the property down because people might not want to live there. So even though the owner of the house might not have been himself racist, he might not have personally had a problem with black people, his perceptions of what people would think in the area and how it would affect the value of the property did change his mind. But also for my friend had to think about it for a minute because he was like, well, in a way, even though I was unaware of the situation, I too am complicit in a kind of a racial outcome here. I bought a house that was earlier on that day denied to a black couple, and I would not have been able to buy this house were it not for the privilege of the color of my skin. So Peggy McIntosh, who's mentioned here on the board, is very, very good at understanding how these sort of invisible privileges work. You or I or whoever might not be, sexist or racist or homophobic, but oftentimes we benefit indirectly and even unconsciously from decisions that are made in society that, while they don't specifically have us in mind, because we fit in the in-group, we benefit somehow. So Peggy McIntosh talks about white privilege and male privilege in this way. And have a look at the quote that she's got here on the slide. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, right? I love that phrase because it speaks exactly to what we're talking about here. My friend who was trying to buy that house, he doesn't go around thinking about himself as a racist because actually I know him really well and he's definitely not a racist, But this is the trick, right? This is what you've got to kind of catch on to, is the idea that maybe our lives are not so morally neutral after all. Maybe, in fact, we do get benefits from racial bias, even though we ourselves are not racist. And the question is how to change it, right? How to do something about that. So the rest of the quote, whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative and average, and also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this is seen as work that will allow them to be more like us. That's a big problem as well, because it can lead to paternalism as opposed to checking in with ourselves, right? we want to go to work on them. We want to go and help them, as opposed to checking with ourselves and seeing, well, what can we do? How can we change our society to be a bit more tolerant, a bit more open-minded to the needs of these people? Okay, I mean, my friend felt very guilty after that experience, actually, and the question, of course, is that even though he was unknowingly complicit in that process, how would we go about creating a society that would, get past some of those issues? And I think, to be honest with you, it's not clear how we would do it, right? But I think education has to be a big point, awareness, and also creating legal change so that you could maybe reverse that situation if ever it came up. But no doubt it happens all the time, and no doubt there'd be a lot of people with vested interests that would not want to see that happen.